Thoughts do not have to become words before they become communication. Most people have experienced this without realizing it. You walk into a room and immediately feel tension before anyone has spoken. Someone smiles politely, yet something inside you quietly says the smile is incomplete. You think of someone moments before they call, or you begin speaking the same sentence at exactly the same time as another person. We usually dismiss these moments because they appear too ordinary to deserve attention, but their familiarity is precisely what makes them important. Language trains us to believe that communication begins when words leave the mouth. Before that, we imagine nothing has been exchanged, yet experience keeps suggesting something else. Your body often understands another person long before your mind has constructed an explanation. By the time words arrive, much of the conversation has already happened beneath awareness. This does not mean every feeling is accurate, nor does it mean intuition is incapable of error. Human emotion can project fear, desire, memory, and expectation onto situations that deserve a clearer reading. The point is not that every impression should be trusted. The point is that communication exists on more than one layer, and learning the difference between projection and perception becomes one of the most important disciplines a person can develop. Imagine two musicians tuning their instruments before performing together. Neither is playing the song, yet both are already adjusting themselves toward harmony. Communication often begins the same way. Before information is exchanged, two fields begin finding relationship with one another. Sometimes they settle naturally into coherence. Sometimes they resist each other before either person understands why. You may notice this in your own life more often than you expect. Certain conversations feel effortless, even when discussing difficult subjects. Others feel exhausting despite speaking about ordinary things. The words may sound equally reasonable in both situations, yet the experience differs dramatically because something deeper than vocabulary is participating. The visible conversation is riding upon an invisible one. When people hear the word telepathy, they often imagine complete sentences appearing inside the mind like subtitles on a screen. That expectation can become an obstacle because it narrows the definition of communication until only one outcome seems valid. If nothing sounds like spoken language, they conclude nothing happened. In doing so, they overlook the quieter forms that have likely been present their entire lives. Consider how much of human communication already operates without speech. A parent's presence can calm a frightened child before any reassurance is spoken. A close friend notices something is wrong simply by watching the way you enter a room. Two people deeply familiar with each other often know when to remain silent because silence itself communicates more accurately than another sentence could. None of these moments require unusual abilities. They reveal capacities already woven into ordinary life. Words excel at describing objects, events, and decisions. They become less effective when attempting to transmit entire states of being. You can explain happiness, but explanation is not happiness. You can define peace, but definition does not allow another person to experience it. Some realities are understood most clearly when they are encountered directly rather than translated into language. That difference becomes increasingly important when considering communication with intelligences that may not organize consciousness the way humans do. If another civilization experiences reality through patterns of relationship instead of sequential language, spoken words would become an inefficient bridge. They would not necessarily communicate less than we do. They might simply communicate differently. What feels incomplete to us could feel perfectly whole to them. Imagine trying to describe music to someone who has never heard sound. No collection of definitions fully replaces hearing a melody for the first time. At some point, explanation reaches its limit because experience carries information that language cannot contain. Communication beyond words may function similarly. Instead of transferring descriptions, it transfers direct recognition. This also changes the responsibility of the receiver. Listening is no longer limited to hearing, it becomes the practice of noticing. You begin observing not only what enters your ears, but what quietly changes inside your awareness during an encounter. Does your attention become clearer or more confused? Does fear suddenly appear without obvious cause? Or does unexpected peace emerge despite uncertainty? These shifts become part of the conversation itself. That does not mean every internal change originates outside yourself. Your own history continually participates in perception. Old memories, unresolved emotions, and unconscious expectations color what you receive. Learning to communicate more deeply, therefore, requires becoming more honest with yourself. Clarity is not achieved by collecting extraordinary experiences, but by reducing the distortion through which every experience is interpreted. Over time, you may discover that inner stillness serves communication better than constant effort. Many people try harder when they want to receive something meaningful. They strain their attention, search for signs everywhere, and analyze every coincidence until exhaustion replaces clarity. Yet stillness often accomplishes what effort cannot because a quiet mind interferes less with what is already present. This begins changing the purpose of personal growth. Instead of becoming someone who possesses unusual abilities, you gradually become someone whose awareness introduces less noise into every interaction. Communication becomes clearer, not because reality has changed, but because you have become easier to communicate with. Presence itself becomes a form of listening. Perhaps this is why the deepest conversations you have ever experienced are rarely remembered for the exact words that were spoken. What remains is how the encounter changed you. You remember feeling understood before you remember the explanation. You remember walking away different before you remember the sentences themselves. Something larger than information had been exchanged. If communication can operate this way between human beings, then the question naturally grows larger without forcing an immediate answer. Instead of asking whether another intelligence could communicate without words, you may eventually begin asking whether words were ever the primary language of consciousness to begin with. That possibility does not ask you to abandon reason. It simply invites you to observe your own experience more carefully, because what first appears to be the edge of communication may only be the edge of language. It is tempting to imagine telepathic communication as a special ability that suddenly appears one day, as though a switch is flipped and an entirely new sense comes online. Yet many of the capacities associated with it already exist in quieter forms. They are woven into ordinary experience so completely that they often escape notice. What changes first is rarely the ability itself. What changes first is your relationship with attention. Attention is not simply where you choose to look. It is also the condition in which information becomes available. Two people can stand in the same place, witness the same event, and leave with entirely different understandings because each was attentive to different layers of reality. One noticed only actions, the other noticed atmosphere, emotional movement, timing, and relationship. Communication expands not only by receiving more, but by becoming capable of noticing more. This is why inner stillness continues to appear wherever meaningful communication is discussed. Stillness is not the absence of thought. It is the reduction of unnecessary movement within awareness. When the surface of a lake becomes calm, it does not create the reflection. It simply allows the reflection that was already possible to become visible. Awareness behaves much the same way. Many people assume that if another intelligence wished to communicate, it would have to become louder than the noise already present in the human mind. That assumption deserves reconsideration. It may be far easier for consciousness to become quieter than for a transmission to become stronger. The obstacle may not be a lack of communication. The obstacle may be the constant movement through which every subtle impression is immediately translated into memory, expectation, fear, or analysis. You can observe this in ordinary conversations. Someone begins speaking while you are already preparing your reply. Their words arrive, but they never fully land because your attention has left the present moment. You hear the language while missing the person. Communication weakens not because either individual lacks intelligence, but because presence has quietly been replaced by anticipation. Now imagine extending that principle beyond human interaction. If communication depends upon direct presence rather than continuous mental activity, then excessive thinking becomes less of an advantage than many people assume. Intelligence remains valuable, but it begins serving awareness instead of competing with it. The clearest understanding often comes after the mind has finished trying to manufacture one. This helps explain why profound moments frequently arrive unexpectedly. They occur while watching rain, walking without destination, sitting quietly before sunrise, or becoming absorbed in something simple. During those moments, the mind has relaxed its constant effort to organize reality. Space appears, and with that space comes the possibility of noticing what constant activity had been covering. Nothing new may have entered awareness. Something old simply became visible. Shared mind space can be approached through a similar understanding. Rather than imagining two minds sending messages back and forth like radios exchanging signals, consider the possibility that both minds participate within a larger field of relationship. Communication becomes less like throwing information across distance and more like recognizing patterns already present within a shared environment. The emphasis shifts from transmission alone to participation. This perspective also changes what listening means. Listening is no longer passive reception, it becomes active alignment. Just as musicians tune themselves before creating harmony together, awareness gradually learns to reduce the patterns that create distortion. Communication improves not because reality becomes clearer, but because the receiver becomes more coherent with what is already there. Coherence should not be confused with agreement. Two people can disagree completely while remaining deeply coherent in communication. They understand what the other truly means even while reaching different conclusions. Likewise, misunderstanding often occurs between people who outwardly agree because neither has actually perceived the experience beneath the words. Meaning travels farther than vocabulary. This becomes especially important when considering resonance-based language. Resonance does not merely describe emotional similarity. It describes the way one state of being naturally awakens recognition within another. A peaceful presence often encourages peace without demanding it. Genuine curiosity invites openness more effectively than argument. Calm steadies the nervous system of those nearby before any explanation is offered. The communication is already occurring through the quality of consciousness itself. That realization places new responsibility upon the communicator. If your state influences communication as much as your words, then personal development is no longer separate from meaningful contact. Patience communicates, integrity communicates, fear communicates, hidden resentment communicates. Long before another being interprets what you say, it may already perceive the condition from which your words emerge. This possibility also encourages humility. We often judge communication by eloquence, vocabulary, or persuasive ability. Yet someone with very few words may communicate extraordinary clarity because their inner condition remains consistent with what they express. Another person may speak beautifully while transmitting confusion because their internal experience contradicts their language. Authenticity becomes increasingly important as communication becomes increasingly subtle. Perhaps this explains why trust develops differently in the deepest relationships. Trust is rarely built through isolated statements. It grows through repeated coherence between presence, action, intention, and speech. Over time, another person stops evaluating individual sentences because they have learned the pattern beneath them. They begin responding to the consistency of being rather than the performance of language. If communication with non-human intelligence follows similar principles, then preparation becomes very different from what most people expect. Instead of collecting secret vocabularies or memorizing symbolic systems, The greater work may involve cultivating clarity, emotional balance, honesty, patience, and sustained awareness. Those qualities do not guarantee contact, but they transform the quality of any communication that does occur. The receiver becomes increasingly capable of recognizing meaning without immediately reducing it into familiar categories. You may even discover that the boundary between human communication and telepathic communication begins to soften. The difference becomes less about crossing into something completely foreign and more about recognizing a continuum that has always existed. Words remain valuable, but they are no longer mistaken for the whole conversation. They become one expression within a much larger landscape of relationship where presence, resonance, intention, and direct knowing quietly participate together. From there, an even more interesting question begins to emerge. If consciousness can communicate through shared presence as naturally as it communicates through language, then understanding another intelligence may depend less on learning its vocabulary and more on discovering the deeper qualities of awareness that every truly meaningful conversation has quietly relied upon from the very beginning. Communication without words ultimately asks a different question than most people expect. It is not simply asking whether thoughts can travel between minds. It is asking what consciousness actually is when language is removed. Strip away vocabulary, memory, culture, and personal history for a moment, and something remains that still recognizes, still observes, and still relates. That deeper layer may be closer to the true participant in communication than the personality that usually speaks. This is why silence deserves far more respect than it is often given. We tend to think of silence as the absence of communication, yet silence frequently reveals the condition in which communication becomes easiest. Two people can sit together without speaking and experience complete understanding. Another two may exchange thousands of words while never truly meeting each other. The difference is not measured by conversation, it is measured by presence. Presence has a quality that cannot be convincingly imitated for long. A person may rehearse the correct words, adopt the right expressions, and perform the expected emotions, but eventually, the deeper condition beneath those actions begins revealing itself. We recognize authenticity because something within us has always been responding to more than appearance. Even if we cannot immediately explain what feels different, we often know that something is. This becomes important when considering contact with another intelligence. We often assume the greatest challenge would be understanding what they are trying to say. Yet an equally significant challenge may be whether we are capable of remaining present enough to receive what is being communicated without forcing it into familiar categories. The mind naturally translates everything into what it already knows. Communication sometimes requires allowing something to remain unfamiliar long enough for genuine understanding to develop. Consider learning a new language as a child. In the beginning, every sentence is translated back into your native language before it feels meaningful. Eventually, something changes. You stop translating and begin understanding directly. The language no longer travels through an intermediate step because your awareness has adapted to a new pattern of recognition. Perhaps communication beyond words develops through a similar transition. If that is true, then resonance based language is less about replacing speech than expanding the ways understanding can occur. Meaning no longer depends upon a sequence of symbols arranged correctly. Instead, entire relationships can become immediately recognizable because the pattern itself is perceived. Rather than assembling understanding piece by piece, awareness begins recognizing wholes before examining their part. You may have already encountered this in your own life without assigning it much significance. Occasionally, you understand an entire situation before you can explain why. Later, as events unfold, your mind gradually catches up to what awareness recognized almost immediately. This is not an argument that every first impression is correct. It is an invitation to notice that understanding sometimes arrives before explanation. That distinction changes how patience functions. Patience is no longer merely waiting for more information. It becomes allowing understanding to mature without demanding immediate certainty. The modern mind often mistakes speed for clarity, but many of life's deepest recognitions unfold slowly because they involve the gradual alignment of multiple layers of perception. Rushing them usually produces conclusions rather than understanding. This is one reason humility protects communication. The moment we become convinced we already know exactly what another person, another culture, or another intelligence must mean, curiosity quietly disappears. Without curiosity, perception narrows. We begin hearing only what confirms our existing conclusions while overlooking everything that does not fit them. Humility keeps awareness open long enough for something genuinely new to be encountered. Notice how this applies to ordinary human relationships as much as extraordinary ones. The strongest conversations are rarely those in which someone wins an argument. They are the ones in which both people leave seeing more than they saw before they began speaking. Real communication enlarges perception. It does not simply transfer information. Something about reality becomes more visible because two perspectives were willing to meet instead of compete. If communication fundamentally enlarges awareness, then preparing for contact also changes meaning. Preparation is not primarily collecting evidence, memorizing reports, or searching constantly for external signs. Those activities may have their place, but they cannot substitute for developing the qualities that allow awareness itself to become clearer. Honesty, emotional maturity, discernment, compassion, and stillness are not separate from communication. They shape the instrument through which communication is received. This perspective also dissolves an unnecessary division between the ordinary and the extraordinary. We often imagine that meaningful contact belongs only to dramatic encounters. Yet every day provides opportunities to refine the same capacities that deeper communication may require. Listening completely to another person, remaining calm when emotion invites reaction, recognizing the difference between assumption and observation, allowing silence to contribute instead of rushing to fill it. These are not merely interpersonal skills, they are exercises in awareness itself. As those capacities develop, something subtle begins changing. You become less interested in proving remarkable experiences and more interested in understanding them. Curiosity replaces urgency. Observation replaces expectation. You begin trusting direct experience without feeling compelled to decorate it with certainty before it has fully revealed its meaning. That shift protects both openness and discernment at the same time. Eventually, you may realize that the deepest purpose of communication has never been the exchange of information alone. Information can educate, persuade, or entertain, but genuine communication transforms relationship. It changes how consciousness meets consciousness. It allows two perspectives to participate in a reality larger than either could perceive independently. Whether those perspectives belong to two human beings or to entirely different forms of intelligence, the principle remains remarkably consistent. Perhaps that is why the most meaningful conversations often continue long after the words have ended. Something remains active within you. A question continues unfolding. An assumption quietly rearranges itself. A new way of seeing begins influencing experiences that have not yet happened. The communication did not conclude when the conversation stopped because its deepest work was never confined to language. So if you continue exploring this subject, do not measure progress only by whether extraordinary experiences appear. Pay attention to the quieter evidence as well. Notice whether you are becoming more present, more patient, more discerning, more capable of listening without immediately translating everything into what you already believe. Those changes may seem ordinary at first, yet they gradually prepare awareness for conversations that words alone could never fully contain. And if that preparation itself becomes part of the communication, then perhaps the dialogue has already begun long before either side ever feels the need to speak.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Haret library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.